I'd like to thank the organizers for this great opportunity for me to present our work on automatic identification of facial tics using selfie videos in Tourette syndrome patients. This work is part of my PhD project under the supervision of Professor Isar Bargad from Bar-Ilan University and in close collaboration with Dr. Noah Ben-Arroya, the director of the Tourette Syndrome Clinic and Schneider Children's Medical Center. Why measure tics? Why is it even important? Well, when doctors see patients only periodically during follow-ups, it's really difficult for them to get an accurate picture of the patient's progression when they rely only on subjective reports. Currently, the gold standard for measuring tics is the YGTSS. However, we know that this is a big challenge in the fact that tics are affected by various factors, and their symptoms fluctuate on multiple timescales in between clinical visits. It's really difficult to get an accurate picture of all of these changes when we don't have an objective continuous way to measure the tics. So although the YGTSS has excellent psychometric properties, it also has limitations that it's taken only periodically during clinical visits and therefore does not account for fluctuations in between visits. And secondly, it's a subjective measure because it relies on the clinician and subjective reports. So it would be useful if we had an objective automatic way to measure tics that can be used over time. And if we had such a measure, we can also, it could provide tools for that we can examine how different factors affect tic expression, and also it could provide tools for more individualized treatments for patients. So therefore, the goal of our research was to create an automatic objective measure to quantify tic expression over prolonged periods of time. And this goal is part of a larger project where we want to quantify the behavioral states that modulate the tic expression. So for our study, we developed the phone application Metis, and in this application, we provide a personalized experience for the patients with tic-related questionnaires, TV shows, games, and as the patients are engaging with the app, the application is recording all of their activity on the phone, and the frontal camera of the app of the phone is filming their face. So we have excellent footage of all their facial movements throughout as they're engaging with the app. Now, we deliver this phone to their home, so the experiment is actually in their natural environment, and we record multiple sessions from every patient. So using this app, we collected data from 14 patients. All of them have Tourette syndrome. They all have facial motor tics. We recorded a total of 42 sessions. We analyzed 25 minutes from every single session, and we extracted short video clips containing either a single tic or a sequence of tics, and we have a total of over 7,000 short video clips. So how did we extract these video clips from the long video recordings? We used manual tic annotation. This isn't a patient, this is an actor demonstrating our tool. The other examples will also just be with actors demonstrating our tools. So we have experienced trained annotators, and where they upload these videos to an interface that we developed, and then they mark the precise timing of the beginning and end of every tic, and they also mark the different sub-movements within a tic sequence. And this is an example of what our interface looks like, and an example of what the spreadsheet as the output of our interface, where we have our annotations, and then we can use them to find the tics within a video. So now that we have these short videos and the timings of all the tics, we can look at different tic properties. So this is an example from a single session. We can look at the duration of tics, and as we can see in this example, the duration of the tics aren't always equal, and that's something that we have to take into account when we want to identify tics. We can also look at the intervals between tics, and we can see here that tics are irregular. Therefore, we can't rely on the timing on tics when we want to make our predictions. So this is an example just from a single session, but we could also see this when we look at the data from all of our patients together. So how do we identify tics from video? Well, tic video data is highly dimensional because it consists both of spatial components, right? Within an image, you want to find the location of the tic. And it also has temporal components because a movement changes over time. Now, each image has 1 million pixels. And if we have multiple frames, we get to tens of millions of parameters. And it's really difficult to work with such high dimensional data. Therefore, in order to reduce the dimensionality, we use facial landmark detection, where we identify 98 key points on the face and we look at their coordinates and we track them over time to identify movements. Well, how can we identify movements using these landmarks? So here's an example of landmarks from a single sequence, and we could look to see which features or which information we can learn from about ticks. So for example, we decided to look at the distance between a pair of landmarks. So if we look at the two orange dots, the corners of the mouth, and we calculate the distance between them, we can look to see how it changes throughout the tick sequence. So the dotted line here represents a single tick, and the solid line represents the mean of all the ticks across a single session. And if we look at the distance between the two orange dots, we can see that there's a transient decrease in the distance throughout the sequence. And if we decide to look at different pairs of landmarks, we can learn different dynamics relating to the ticks. So now that we see that calculating the distance of the landmarks could be useful, we decided to calculate the distance between all of the landmarks on the face, and we plot them on a 2D matrix of all the distances, and we call this landmark feature maps, or for short, LFMs. Now, how can we use these LFMs to identify ticks? So for this, we use machine learning, which is a field in computer science and math in which we show a model, many samples, or in our case, we take a video and we segment it to short video clips. Each one contains a tick or does not, depending on the annotations that I mentioned earlier. And the model then, when we're presented with the data and the corresponding labels, it has to learn what separates these two classes. And then we'll show it new samples that hasn't been trained on, and it has to classify whether the video contained a tick or not. So how did we implement this model? We first took a video with n frames. For every frame, we identified the facial landmarks, and then we used them to calculate the distance between them in an LFM. And then we took, for every 2 consecutive frames, we subtracted one LFM from the other. So we have n-1 maps of the deltas of the distances. We then decided to take these n-1 frames and feed them into a neural network that has 2 stages. The first stage looks at spatial components, and the second stage looks at temporal components. And the final output of the model is classification, whether this video contained a tick or not. Now we want to see what was our model able to learn? What information was important? So if we look at the top row, this is an example of the LFM deltas that we fed into the neural network. The middle row is what's called saliency maps, which we look to see which part of the input is the most influential when making the classification decision. Now we said that every point there represents the distance between 2 landmarks. So we can then take the top percentile, the most influential points, and translate them back to distances and see which areas of the face were most influential. So the bottom row is looking at the distance, and we can see that at first the model looked at the distances between the 2 eyes and the distance between the mouth and the nose. And as we continue in the tick sequence, we see that the focus shifts to the area of the face that is related to the tick. So how did our model do overall in the classification test? So as I mentioned, we show the model different short segments. We use 80% of these segments to train the model, and then we wanted to test the model the remaining 20% to see how well can it classify them. Here's an example from a single session, and as we can see here, the model was able to classify correctly 98% of the time. If we look at data from all the patients, we can see that the accuracy level was 93%. Now, these are pretty nice results. However, we know that in general, in real life, we don't always have all of our data when we want to train our model. What happens when now the model is now exposed to a new session or a new patient that it hasn't been trained on? So for this, we use the leave one out cross validation, in which for every patient, we start on the session level. For every patient that we recorded 4 sessions, we trained our model on 3 of the sessions and tested on the 4th. And we wanted to see how well can it classify videos when they're taken from a session that hasn't been trained on. We can see here the leave one out session, the model was able to classify correctly 93% of the time. We can also see in these results that between the different sessions, we see some patients show high variability. Now, this can be explained by the fact that, as we know, Tics change over time. So for some patients, they had a certain tic in one session, but this tic was not apparent in other sessions. And therefore, when the model was being tested, it didn't know how to identify that tic. We also did this on the patient level, where we trained the model on all the patients except for one, and then we wanted to test its accuracy on the remaining patient. And we see here too that although it's a harder task, the model was able to accurately classify over 90% of the segments. Now here too, we can see that some patients, the performance wasn't as good. And this could also be explained by the fact that these patients had unique tics. So these tics were not represented in the data during the training. Now, this can teach us two things. First of all, it shows us the importance by if we record more data from more patients across a bigger variety of different types of tics, this will lower our chances of the model being exposed to a new type of tic that it hasn't been trained on. Secondly, we can learn from here that it shows us the model is really looking at identifying tics and not general movements, because when it's exposed to a unique type of tic, it doesn't know how to identify it. However, if it was just looking at movements in general, then this is something that's been trained on, then the model should have been able to learn to identify these movements. So I just like to conclude that smartphones are devices that most of us use and walk around with all day, and we can use them to collect large sets of clinical data across different behaviors and across a variety of settings without being constrained to only clinical and lab settings. Secondly, if we had the ability to automatically and objectively measure tics over time, this could help us examine the efficacy of different therapeutic options, such as different medications or behavioral therapies. And lastly, the idea of automatic identification is not unique to Tourette syndrome, and this idea could be extended to other disorders such as OCD, ADHD, and so on. So with that, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Professor Izar Bargad, and the rest of the IBG lab members. I'd also like to thank our collaborators, Dr. Noah Ben-Arroyo, Professor Apter, Dr. Steinberg, and Dr. Feldman-Sadeh, and all the members of Tourette Clinic from Schneider Medical Center. I thank you all for your help, and thank you all for listening.